The French government has announced a ban on all protests expressing solidarity with Palestine. Despite the order, thousands of protesters gathered in Paris and other cities in France on Thursday to express their support for Palestine. These scenes were shot at the Place de la République in central Paris. Soon, police turned up to end the protest, making 10 arrests wearing riot gear. They tried to disperse the crowds using water cannons, batons, and even tear gas grenades. Ash, can you see something like this happening in the United Kingdom, where we have the government trying to curtail the right to peaceful, lawful assembly?
We're already seeing the government attempt to curtail peaceful, lawful assembly. That's been the nature of the legislation that they pushed through, meaning that there is an incredibly low threshold for police dispersing or criminalizing peaceful protest. And just look at what Suella Braverman's been coming out with this week. She's been talking about making it a criminal offense to wave the Palestinian flag, to make it a criminal offense to chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. The Conservative Party has been ramming through legislation to make it more difficult to support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And that's before you get to, I think, a media campaign to pick on individuals who are tweeting, who are posting things which are supportive of Palestinian rights, indeed, the Palestinian right to resistance, and holding them up as public hate figures. That is sort of incorporated into this wider moral panic around left-wing anti-Semitism. And what do you call that if not a government, and wider than the government, a political class backlash against free expression and peaceful protest? I do hope that the protests which are planned tomorrow remain peaceful. And what that relies on is a lack of police provocation and antagonism as well. You and I, Aaron, have been on protests all our lives, really. And we've seen that quite often when you see media images of aggressive protesters, that what's led up to that is often hours and hours and hours of police antagonism, sometimes police violence. So I do hope that the police understand that is their job to facilitate peaceful protest and not to try and turn it into something which is more hostile.
So there's Emmanuel Macron banning displays of Palestinian solidarity. And our own political leaders appear to support Israel's bombardment and blockade of Gaza. But another senior politician has shown more courage. Take a look at this interview with Ireland's Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar.
What would you say to her about what's happening in Gaza at the moment, the bombardment, the blockade? Is it proportionate, the response?
Well, I believe Israel has the right to defend itself, but Israel doesn't have the right to do wrong. What do I mean by that? Israel is a country that is surrounded by enemies, brutal, savage groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, countries like Iran, often supported by Islamic fundamentalists and anti-Semites around the world. So Israel is under threat. They do have a right to defend themselves, but they don't have the right to breach international humanitarian law. And I'm really concerned about what I'm seeing happening in Gaza at the moment. To me, it amounts to collective punishment, cutting off power, cutting off fuel supplies and water supplies. That's not the way a respectable democratic state should conduct itself.
So do you think they are breaching fundamental law?
I believe by targeting civilians and by cutting off civilian infrastructure, that is a breach of international humanitarian law. And I think it's very important for us as Ireland to make sure that that voice is brought to the table at European Union level. So yes, Hamas should release all of the hostages immediately. Israeli citizens and dual citizens alike. Israel is entirely justified in going after Hamas in Gaza and elsewhere. But operations that clearly affect civilians disproportionately are wrong. Cutting off electricity, cutting off water, that's not acceptable. And one thing we definitely need to see happen now, and we'll do anything we can through the UN to achieve this, is the opening of a humanitarian corridor between Egypt and Gaza.
Ash, I've got a question for you. Why is common sense so rare with Westminster politicians? And yet you look at Mark Drakeford, they have their problems at the moment, but in recent years, the SNP have been, competent politicians who can present a reasonable face to the world. You look at Scotland, you look at Ireland. This gentleman is not on the left. He comes from a centre-right party historically. And it feels like, these are all countries or nations in our near abroad, and yet they possess a composure and an intelligence we simply don't see from Westminster politicians.
I think the reason for that is that Westminster politics and Washington politics have been pretty substantively impacted by a project by Israeli advocates, by lobbyists for the Israeli states. Now, I'm not saying that in a sort of conspiratorial Israel lobby kind of way. There are lobbyists for Saudi Arabia, there are lobbyists for Turkey. Israel has its advocates and its lobbyists who work to try and shift political opinion and political policy overseas, like many other states also do. But it's been the project of Israeli advocates, Israeli lobbyists, and pro-Israel, civil society organizations to make it really difficult to factually describe what Israel is doing and to create a climate in which it is near impossible to push back on Israel's repeated breaches of international law. So I'm not just talking about this most recent crisis, but the ongoing illegal occupation, the de facto apartheid, which has been identified by Amnesty International, and the ongoing blockade of Gaza. What's happened, particularly in England, Westminster, and Washington, has been a concerted attempt to make criticism of Israel, legitimate criticism of Israel, to tar it with the brush of anti-Semitism. I believe that that's what the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism attempts to do. You've got this hugely broad definition and 11 examples, most of which concern what people can or can't say about the state of Israel. And, kinds of lawfare like that have been really successful in the Westminster context. It's been a bit less successful in the Washington context, but still it is remarkably influential. And I think because you haven't had the phenomenon of Jeremy Corbyn being attacked with the accusation of anti-Semitism in Scotland that's not been a part of Irish politics, it means that the centre-right and the centre-left can uphold, I think, some quite basic standards of liberalism, which is that attacks on civilians, collective punishment, breaches of international law are wrong. And it's a sign of how captured our institutional centre-left has been in this country that it is impossible to imagine Keir Starmer or the Labour front bench saying anything like what the centre-right Leo Varadkar is saying. I think when it comes to the SNP is obviously a very, very broad coalition ranging from so-called tartan Tories to people who would describe themselves as socialists. Humza Yousaf has been, more on the progressive end of his party. And also I think it is really meaningful that he has family that's currently trapped in Gaza. I think that when you know that there are people who you love trapped in that situation, you have no choice but to recognize their humanity and to advocate for the recognition of their humanity. But that's not a set of experiences which is widely shared on the Labour front bench, and also the Labour front bench is scared of being attacked with the same moral panic that Jeremy Corbyn was.